Hello class, in this video we will be learning about galvanic cells and how they're harnessed as a source of energy. Before I discuss what galvanic cells are, it's important for us to have a solid understanding of what redox reactions are. A redox reaction is a type of reaction that involves the transfer of electrons. This process involves two separate reactions: oxidation, which involves the loss of electrons, and reduction, which involves the gaining of electrons. When we are given a chemical equation, we can identify the species undergoing oxidation and reduction by examining the oxidation numbers of the conjugate redox pairs. In this example, we can see that the oxidation of zinc went from 0 to a positive 2, and since the oxidation number has increased, this indicates that zinc is undergoing oxidation. Hence, we can write the oxidation half equation like this. Conversely, the oxidation number of copper went from a positive 2 to 0, which means that copper has gained electrons and is thus reduced. Similarly, we can represent this reaction by writing a reduction half equation. In this redox reaction, we can see that the oxidation of the zinc metal results in zinc dissolving into solution and forming zinc 2 ions. Hence, the mass of the zinc metal slowly decreases, which is shown in the diagram below. Simultaneously, the copper 2 ions found in the electrolyte solution is reduced by gaining the electrons released from the oxidation of zinc and forms copper metal. You can also see this in the diagram below, where the copper metal is represented by the orange particles forming on the zinc metal. Although the movement of electrons is present in this redox reaction, we cannot harness this to produce electrical energy because the oxidants and reductants are directly in contact with one another and can readily transfer the electrons. In order to generate electrical energy, we need to provide a pathway for the electrons to travel such that it can therefore power up an electrical device. This can be achieved by separating the site of oxidation and reduction into two separate compartments or half cells such that the reactants are no longer in direct contact with one another. In doing so, this forces the electrons to flow through this piece of wire, which produces electricity, which can then power up an electrical device such as a lamp that is connected in this same circuit. It is really important to recognize that no electricity is produced when the site of oxidation and reduction occurs in the same cell. The setup that we have on the right hand side is what we refer to as a galvanic cell. Let me now discuss this in a bit more detail. Galvanic cells, also known as voltaic cells, are electrochemical cells which convert chemical energy into electrical energy. An example of a galvanic cell would be your mobile phone battery. As the battery is being used up or is discharging, we are converting the chemical energy stored in the battery into electrical energy to power up your mobile phone device. The redox reaction in a galvanic cell occurs spontaneously. This means that the reaction occurs naturally by itself and doesn't require any input to initiate the reaction. When we have multiple cells connected in series, we now refer to this setup as a battery. Let's now learn about the design features of a galvanic cell. I'll first briefly mention what they are, and I'll then explain the purpose of the design features later on. All galvanic cells are made up of two half cells which are generally contained inside a beaker. In most scenarios, each half cell is comprised of a metal and its redox conjugate. So this means that you'll often have a metal placed inside its metal solution. Galvanic cells contain two electrodes, which is a conductive material which allows electrons to flow through it. One of the electrodes is referred to as the cathode and the other is referred to as the anode. A galvanic cell also contains a salt bridge, which provides a bridge or a passageway between the two half cells. The last design feature is a wire, which is a material that is connected between the two electrodes such that the electrons can therefore be transported from the site of oxidation to the site of reduction. Generally, the diagrams of a galvanic cell typically have the anodes illustrated on the left-hand side and the cathodes illustrated on the right-hand side. However, this isn't really a rule, so please don't always make this assumption. The next thing that I would like to discuss about is the location where oxidation and reduction takes place. Please note that for all cells, the site of oxidation will always occur at the anode, whereas the site of reduction occurs at the cathode. Using this knowledge, you should be able to write the half equation occurring at the anode and cathode. I've got a mnemonic which can help you remember where oxidation and reduction takes place, which is read as ANOX, red cat. ANOX stands for anode is oxidation and red cat stands for reduction is cathode. Since we know that oxidation involves losing electrons, electrons will therefore flow from the anode to the cathode, which is shown here in the diagram. The charge or the polarity of the anode is going to be negative because oxidation results in the build-up of electrons, whereas cathode will be positively charged because the electrons are being used up to reduce the oxidant, which typically forms a metal that gets deposited on the electrode. Now that we understand what happens at the anode and cathode, let's now look at a bit more detail as to how galvanic cells work to generate electrical energy. At the anode, the reducing agent will undergo oxidation, and the electrons that's released from this reaction will flow from the anode to the cathode through the wires, and you can see that from the direction of these arrows over here. When the electrons reach the cathode, the oxidizing agent, which is the positive cations in the solution, will be reduced and forms copper metal, which deposits on the copper electrode. Due to the movement of electrons between the half cells, this generates an electrical current which powers the electrical device that is connected in the circuit. It is very important to note that this process will only work in conjunction when a salt bridge is present, which is composed of ions. The cations of the salt bridge will move towards the cathode half cell, whereas the anions of the salt bridge will move towards the anode half cell. Without the salt bridge, you will not be able to generate an electrical current, and I'll provide more detail on this later on. Let's now test for our understanding. In a galvanic cell, where does reduction take place? If you remember the mnemonic anox red cat, you should know that reduction only takes place at the cathode. Which of the following species is oxidized in the following diagram? The species that's undergoing oxidation is going to be zinc in this case, as you can see by its half equation, as it's lost electrons. In a galvanic cell, why is the cathode positively charged and the anode negatively charged? In your explanation, you should say that the anode is negatively charged because oxidation takes place, the lost electrons build up on the surface of the anode, making it negatively charged, whereas the cathode is positively charged because reduction takes place, which removes the electrons from the electrode, making it positively charged. We're now going to be looking at the finer details of galvanic cells to understand the importance of certain design features and components that enables the galvanic cell to work. So we're going to explain why galvanic cells requires two separate half cells. We're going to understand what is the function of the salt bridge, and lastly, we're going to look at what electrodes can be used in a galvanic cell. The reason why galvanic cells requires two separate compartments is because that we need to prevent the direct reaction between oxidants and reductants. In other words, this just means that we don't want the oxidants and reductants being in direct contact with one another. When the site of oxidation and reduction occurs in two separate half cells, we can harness the movement of electrons that flow from the anode to cathode to power the electrical device. In this setup, chemical energy is converted into electrical energy. On the other hand, if we have the site of oxidation and reduction occurring within the same compartment, this setup allows the reactants to react spontaneously, and the electron transfer process occurs immediately as they are in direct contact with each other. Consequently, no electrical energy is produced, and instead thermal energy is released. These processes are conveniently summarized by the flowchart over here. I would now like to discuss about the function of the salt bridge. A salt bridge is a device which contains ions that migrate into each half cell. As I've mentioned earlier, the cations of the salt bridge move towards the cathode, and the anions of the salt bridge move towards the anode. There are two functions of the salt bridge. Firstly, the salt bridge helps complete the circuit, which means it is designed to help create an uninterrupted closed loop. And secondly, the salt bridge helps prevent the accumulation of charge. As the redox reaction progresses, more and more electrons are moving towards the cathode, hence there will be a temporary buildup of negative charge at the cathode. To balance the charges, the cations in the salt bridge move towards the half cell containing the cathode. In contrast, the anode half cell effectively becomes less negative as electrons are moving away from the anode. Hence, the anions in the salt bridge move towards the anode to balance the charges. I would recommend that you remember a couple of electrolytes that are commonly used as salt bridges. This is important when you're asked to draw a diagram of a galvanic cell. Electrolytes commonly used in salt bridges include potassium chloride, potassium nitrate, and silver nitrate. It is important that the electrolytes found in the salt bridge are inert so that it doesn't participate in any chemical reactions. This is important because we don't want any side reactions occurring which may interfere or reduce the efficiency of the galvanic cell to produce electrical energy. The last thing that I would like to talk about are the different types of electrodes that you may encounter in a galvanic cell. Half cells may contain a metal electrode or an inert electrode such as platinum or graphite. The half cell on the left contains a metal electrode placed in its metal solution. The second image shows that both species in its conjugate redox pairs are in its ionic form, and in the last image, one of the species in a conjugate pair is a gas. As shown in the last two images, we tend to use inert electrodes when one of the conjugate pairs is a gas or when both of the conjugate pairs are ions. Although the inert electrodes do not take part in the redox reaction, it is a special conductive material that helps mediate the transfer of electrons to and from the electroactive species. Because it is inert, the mass of an inert electrode such as platinum will remain the same, as you're not going to be getting any metals that's going to be deposited on the electrode. Let's quickly check for our understanding. Which direction does the anions of the salt bridge move towards? If you answered this correctly, you should have said that the anions of the salt bridge move towards the oxidation half cell. The reason being is because the anions move towards the anode, and the anode is the site of oxidation. By now, you should be able to meet the following success criteria. This is the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys again in the next one. Bye.